Thank you. So I just want to start by thanking the three of you, Edith, Marcel, and Livia, for the invitation. I want to thank Katarina for her talk. I feel honored to be in such good company. Just a couple of hours before the talk, I added this quotation by a friend of mine who I met some years ago, over 10 years ago, at an artist residency when he was just beginning his creative writing career. And he just won the Pulitzer Prize for his first novel. And so he wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times recently called The Fall of Empire, about what's happening in the US. And the last line of his talk was, "Empires rot from the inside, even as emperors blame the barbarians." And it seemed like a really perfect way to frame a lot of like the perspective from which I work, but a lot of what's happening in the world right now. And I'll talk more about that. And so I actually wanted to start tonight by telling you a story that I encountered while I was doing research. As Livia mentioned, I was researching anthropological archives at Harvard University earlier this year. And I was invited by the Newhouse Center for Humanities, which is connected to Wellesley College. This is an elite women's college in the US. Their previous alumni include Hillary Clinton and Madeleine Albright. And they funded me to spend 2 months doing research connected to a project that I'll talk about later in the talk called Blowback. And so I'm gonna put up this first image. And so the story relates to these images. So what you're looking at on the, I don't know how you guys see it. Oh, so on the left is an image of an anonymous woman photographed in the 19th century by the French photographer Bonfils. And on the right is a picture of Henry Kissinger, and who served simultaneously as a special national security advisor under Nixon and as a Secretary of State, actually both under Nixon and Ford. And I won't assume that everybody knows who he is or what he's done, but he's one of the, I guess, late 20th century's, like, one of the greatest architects of evil. He is behind many deaths, many torture campaigns, coups in democratically elected regimes. He is quite a terrible character, and I'm not sure if his history has carried over into other generations or around the world. And so the story that I wanted to start with actually begins with my research at the Peabody Archives. The Peabody Museum is an anthropological museum that's in a part of Harvard. It's the oldest anthropology museum in the US. And while I was there, the archivist suggested to me that across the street was a museum called the Semitic Museum, also part of Harvard. And they had a collection of 19th century Middle Eastern photographs that I would possibly be interested in. And after some phone calls and trying to track this down, I got a call back from somebody at the Semitic Museum who referred me then to a further library at Harvard, who now housed what are known as the Semitic Core Collection. It's a collection of thousands of photographs dating back to the 19th century, some of the first images of the region. And once I arrived at the Fine Arts Library, which now houses these images, I was told a story by the librarian. And I told this story briefly to Katarina and to Livia last night. But today I did further research into the story, so I wanted to kind of share that with you before talking about my work. because it both relates to kind of how I work in terms of working with archives, but it also very specifically, the story relates to the thematics of this exhibition in terms of radical politics from the 60s and 70s and what was available to as strategies that has now come to be off the table and is not available seemingly to left-wing political activists today. And so on October 4th in 1970, no one knew that these photographs that I went to look at existed before this date. They had been lost and forgotten since they were first collected. They first started collecting these photographs in 1892. And so also by 1970, Kissinger, who was formerly a professor at Harvard, had left to serve as Nixon's special advisor on national security, but he still had a Harvard-based think tank that was called the Center for International Affairs. And they rented offices within the Semitic Museum during the 70s. And so the story that I was told was that a group of radical women planted a bomb in Henry Kissinger's office. So what it was is they suspect two women to have planted a bomb in the offices of the Center for International Affairs. The bomb was set to go off at midnight so that nobody would get hurt, and no one did. But in the aftermath of the explosion, the director of the Semitic Museum, in the eaves of the ceiling of the roof, noticed red, dusty boxes, and inside these boxes contained something like 28,000 photographs that they didn't know they had. And among these, about 800 were a part of, were taken by Bonfils, this famous French photographer who photographed the Middle East. And so this was the story that I was told. This was my encounter before getting to examine and look at these images. And so it was a great story for me to hear. It was really instructive, but it relates to this idea of radical politics and what it looked like in the 70s and how different it looks today. And so for me, and from my stance, I think September 11th had a lot to do with that. The global war on terror has a lot to do with changing the terms of what is possible. And so the label of terrorist, who gets to use violence and who doesn't get to use violence, these are things that have changed. And while I don't count myself as an activist, my work as an artist is a response to this character of structural and political violence that we experience in our daily lives. And in my work, I'm trying to bring it into the realm of intimate felt experience. And so I'm going to just go through a few projects, some early and leading up to what's in the exhibition now, and just kind of talk through them. And some of them deal with archives, some of them deal with books, and then we'll just go from there. So this is a project from 2001. Before I moved to New York, and it was called the Viewing Project. And the images in this project, these are they're cutout paintings. They're oil on wooden panel, and the backs were turned to the viewers, and the viewers were invited to kind of pose inside the painting, and they could see themselves reflected back in a mirror that hung on the wall opposite. And the subjects of the paintings came from the photographic archives at the British Museum. They have an ethnographic photo archive, and it was probably the first archive I had used and made a work from. And so this is an image of me posing inside so this is what I would see when I looked in the mirror. And this is another image from the same project. And this is an image of an ayah with a child. And a lot of my work, then I was dealing with colonial images from India. But it's refracted through my sort of diasporic identity of being American. And so for me to look at these colonial images of Indian ayahs, which are nursemaids, I would immediately connect that with images of slavery in the South, in the American South. And so how I looked at these images are, these colonial Indian images were refracted through an American perspective. And then this last image from the project is the perspective of the camera photographing itself. So it's where you would have placed your head if you were the viewer. And then this is 2001, and in 2002, actually this is 2001, and just in the summer of 2001, in August, just before September 11th, I moved to New York to start the Whitney program. And we were set to start on September 11th, 2001. And this was sort of my transition, and my first experience of New York was post September 11th. I had 2 weeks prior in the city, and then these very dramatic changes. And so this next work I'm showing is the first work that I made while I was at the Whitney program, and just after the attacks happened. And it involves a book that I had for 2 years. And so often I have materials and kind of a long incubation process. It's like I can think about things for 2 to 5 years before I actually start to work on them. And then when I paint and draw with the materials, it can go really fast. I can work quickly, but I'm somehow still, I would think of myself as, I have a slow process. And so this is an image, this is a gouache drawing on a book page, and the book page is a 19th century children's text published in Boston, and it's called the People and Places Here and There, Stories of India, and it was part of a geography series that was published for children. And for me, I had this book given to me as a gift, and I kept it. And I was both repulsed by the kind of racist content, but also drawn by the character of the engravings and the kind of this. There was this kind of contradiction between the beauty of the engraving and the quality, and then the racism. And what I was also struck by during this time period was that the ideology underpinning this children's book from the 19th century was almost identical to what was being printed in the mainstream media post-September 11th. So all of the language of the East as barbaric, primitive, and somehow an affront to Western civilization, and the West being civilized, technologically advanced, and so forth. Like all of these kinds of arguments, these old imperial arguments were very much part of the conversation in the US after September 11th. And this is another image. This is actually I was interested in this image because this is Nana Sahib, who was instrumental in the mutiny, the Indian mutiny, which was a great kind of like uprising in the 19th century that was crushed against the British. And as a figure, there was a kind of a caricature that was made of him with like big lips and nose. And for me, there was a similarity in how Osama bin Laden was being portrayed at the time. And so kind of played on that. And then this is hear no evil, speak no evil, see no evil. This is, I think, called Childhood Sweethearts. And then this is kind of a 19th century battle scene that I overpainted as well. And then I'm going to show some images from, and then shortly after this, I began a project called Cassell's Illustrated History of India. And I was still interested in working with books and engravings and the texts of books, but I was interested in moving beyond the use of irony and also coming out of the Whitney program, which was a highly theoretical program. I wanted to try to work with intuition, and I wanted to kind of trust that whatever politics, that my life had inscribed a set of politics that I didn't have to go out and look for theory in order to and attach my work to theoretical debates, but that I had a kind of lived experience of it and to kind of trust this. And so I made this work really privileging intuition, and it's a work that invoked, it was shown a lot in New York about 10 years ago. And I guess one of the things that what to say about it? Well, something that kind of characterizes the reception of it. It's kind of a difficult project to talk about because I was, so this last work is called You Said It Wouldn't Hurt. This is Negotiations for Peace. And this is, it started with someone's lie. And so like this kind of showing of this project around New York culminated in a show at kind of a major commercial gallery. But the response to the work was really like a lot of silence. Harvard looked at this work because they were considering to buy some of my work. And I think the trustees said that the work was too political, too controversial, too sexual, and that it would offend their students. And now I kind of wear this as a kind of badge of honor, but at the time I needed money, so it was hard. But that was essentially the line that this project got. And then also the other thing that was kind of the way it was received is that people then started to try to pathologize me, that my biography must be part of this, and that it can't be about colonial history, and the violence can't be about that. And that, I think, scared me. And so I backed away from this way of working to a certain degree. So this next project was made, just to kind of time frame, the People and Places project was about 2001 to 2003. Cassell's started right around the start of the Iraq War. And for me, that project also was about processing what was happening in the Iraq War and Abu Ghraib and all of that, but kind of symbolically. And this next project is kind of moving forward in 2010. It's from a project called Double Take. And these are large-scale watercolors. These are like 2 meters in height. And this is called A Brief History of Afghanistan. And this is kind of like using the same kind of materials, these kind of engravings, 19th century photographs. But then rather than leaving the trace of them, I wanted to kind of work with this larger scale and see what the impact would be on me, on the viewer, to work in this way. And so humor goes in and out of my work and my projects, and sometimes it seems to be the right register for me, or that I need it, and sometimes in certain projects, which I'll talk about later, Did You Kiss a Dead Body, there's no humor to be found. This is also from the same series, but this is, I reproduced an engraving found in a 19th century newspaper called the London Graphic of a 19th century Afghan battle scene, and then overpainted it. And so it's a digital print, but then painted on top with gouache and acrylic ink. And this is called The Shadow of the Future, which is a reference to Condoleezza Rice's testimony to Congress when asked why the Bush administration went to war when they knew there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. She answered in this very prophetic and poetic line, and she said, "We were aware of the shadow of the future." And this is another image from this series. It's called Pear Soap. It's called This is the Way We Wash Our Hands. This is a kind of pear soap. It's just one of these kind of like the colonial product that kind of went all over the world. It's like British thing that's like still, you know, my friend, actually the professor who was kind of instrumental in having me come to Wellesley, who is from Bombay, and his mother, whenever she comes to visit him in the US, like he has to order 20 bars of pear soap for her, so it's like the only thing she will bathe with. But this is a famous song and advertisement for them. So, so the next project that I'm going to talk about is Did You Kiss the Dead Body? And this is work that began in 2009, and it's kind of been going off and on, and it's a project also that's really hard to do because it involves my reading of US military autopsy reports. So these were reports that I initially found on the ACLU's website in 2004. They sued the US government for the release of any documents relating to their to torture and to prisoners, and they won the lawsuit, and but they received far more documents than they thought they would ever receive. So they received like 100,000 documents, pages of documents, and this came to be known as the torture FOIA, the FOIA being Freedom of Information Act, what they sued under. And these documents are very cold, analytical, scientific descriptions of men's bodies. And they're only of men because there's lots of contradictions with these reports, but they only made these for men that died in US custody because they won't admit that they ever held women or children. But they, so the military produced these documents when someone would die, someone was murdered or killed, and they would determine a cause of death. And so these reports are really horrific in a way, and it took me about 5 years to think of a way to work with them. And as you've noticed, like all of my projects look very different from one another, and I try to find the language that's right for a given context or given story. And with these, it took some time for me to try to find the right language that could carry the weight of what these documents are. And so they're digital files that exist on the internet that I print. I marble them, which is a kind of very old technique, and once they're marbled, I then make ink drawings on them that reference usually European anatomical drawings. And so these, I think there are 3 or 4 images that I'll show, come from the same, and I also kind of like my work, I don't have sort of the work perfectly figured out at the beginning. So it's like when I first began, I would take a page from an autopsy report from here or from there and make separate images. And then, you know, after some time of working on these, I realized that I needed to keep the autopsy reports intact. And so they vary in length depending on the autopsy report. So it can be 6 pages in length, or it can be 11 pages in length, often depending on what they were trying to cover up, because the ones where it seems like something, you know, that something terrible happened, there's a lot more explanation involved, and so the autopsy report becomes much longer. And so this is, these are all from one report, but I won't show the entire, but just an excerpt, so that we can have time also to talk. And then this is almost the last project for the show. I'm showing a lot, but I like images, and so so this is actually, this is a project that I started, and it was that was connected to this research, why I was at Harvard. And it's a project called Blowback. And it began actually in 2012 because I had an experimental residency that I proposed and kind of created at the American Civil Liberties Union in 2012. And so I had already had this kind of body of work around these autopsy reports that they had litigated and put into the public space. And I kind of, I spent 2 months kind of reflecting on the legal nature of these documents. And back to this residency, I had another residency in Amsterdam to look at the photo archive at the Tropen Museum. And at the time, I was thinking how on the surface of it, the archive at the ACLU, these autopsy reports, these reports, and the kind of photographs that are in the Tropen Museum's archives, they seem to be unrelated, or they would appear unrelated to most people. And for me, there was a deep connection, a deep kind of representational violence, one with images, one with words, but for me was very much connected to a kind of continuum. And I think I've often looked at historical sources as a way of better defining the present and finding new ways to define the present. And I wanted to find a way to connect. How would I bring an audience, or how would I bring others into seeing the connections that I felt intuitively and instinctively were there? And it got me thinking about the kinds of images that exist in kind of anthropological portraiture, and where this kind of mute native subject is often without agency and power, and how that's one kind of representation of the non-European body. And then I was thinking about that in contrast to how the non-European body is seen today. And I was also, thinking about having moved to Europe. I often feel there's a deep discomfort in Germany, for instance, around brown and black people, for white Germans. And so this discomfort, I wanted to exaggerate what this is about. And so I started thinking about what are the tropes that, and the iconography that's associated with terrorism or political violence that's labeled as terrorism. And can I put these things together? Can I both give agency back to the photographic subject of these anthropological portraits, and so kind of revisit them, and somehow try to reflect on that. And so then this is a sculpture, a painted sculpture that's actually in 7 parts, and it's sort of, I guess, a little bit under 2 meters high. And this is another image from the series, also a sculpture. And this is called Vitruvian Man, or How I Learned to Love the Bomb. And this is untitled, Woman with Grenades, but maybe a woman with grenades doesn't need a title. And this is a drawing and painting kind of combined. And these are, again, like anthropological sources. These are images held in German archives. And so I'm just going to switch now to and end with talking about the work that's in the exhibition. And so this quote by Karl von Ossietzky, "We cannot look to the conscience of the world when our own conscience is asleep," seems really apt. And something about, I started to read his essays only recently, and I became aware of him because of this exhibition. And I feel, for me, I couldn't help but think about the American elections and what's happening in terms of the rise of fascism worldwide. His analysis, it was really interesting for me to read him because, you know, in a just kind of a very rough portrait, you know, his analysis really holds for this moment. He kind of cites the Social Democrats in Germany as, you know, betraying the working classes, wealth being removed, you know, being removed into fewer and fewer hands, and how these factors really open the door, pathway to fascism and to National Socialism. And for me, it's just like to read him, it was really like reading, you know, it's like what's happening in Austria, what's happening here, what's happening in the US. It's really like, he becomes a really interesting frame. And I think I just wanted to kind of end with that, is that, you know, even with this kind of project, and I'll just show one image from this work that I made. So you guys, well, maybe I'll just say a little something about, I tried to keep what I was going to do. You know, I wanted to do a project about him, but I wasn't sure what it was going to look like or what form it was going to take. And then when I had a conversation with Edith and Marcel about the story where he made this kind of coded request to journalists for a book on medieval torture. For me, it was this moment that because of my previous work with Did You Kiss the Dead Body, because that I am always interested in not just like kind of violence as an abstraction, but really like where it rests in the body and how the body experiences this, and where it's an intimate experience. It's always about finding, you know, it's like I also had to find my own position within what I was going to do, and suddenly this, hearing that he made this request, I felt like I could answer this request, and I can't give it to him, but if I had been there, then I could, you know, this is maybe how I could have answered him. And at least acknowledge that this was an experience that he had. And I think like sometimes there's these legacies, or there's these people that get also, like, you know, the university was named after him, and I guess in certain circles he's there's an understanding of his significance, but I also think that sometimes this this trauma of, like, you know, that he was a political prisoner, the torture he experienced, these things, I don't think our attention often rests there. We don't want to stay there, and I guess I wanted to acknowledge this aspect, because it's somehow it's something, it's a universal. Or can be a universal. And so just to say that I think like that it's an interesting place, that it, like, to be here in Oldenburg, it's like, you know, you can use him, Ossietzky, you can use his writings as a way of analyzing and filtering the world, and it's like you can start from your own position and then keep moving out to like. And so, like, working with history gives you this chance to look at, like, repetitions of power, and also, but then also like resistance movements to that power, which is back to the exhibition. And then I'll end there. Yeah.